Hello.
Visible.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first workshop of Spybits event. In total, there will be 5 workshops. Today, we will be covering the basic tools that we would require to solve any problem of cryptography and uh, cybersecurity. So I will be covering the Python part, and Saurabh will be covering the number theory part. Number theory is also important for competitive programming and interviews, so that it would help in that also. So starting with Python. Python was created by Van Rossum in 1991. It was widely used general purpose language and high level programming language. Python works on different platforms like Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. Python is also used almost in every field of software and machine learning, like machine learning, cryptography, software game development, image processing, backend development, and desktop GUI. So why Python? Python is specially designed for making it quick to write, so ease of integrate with system, and emphasis on code readability. Syntax was specially designed to make it easy for anyone to write code. Here you can see Python is used in almost every field of computer science. So for installation of Python, in many computers, Python is already installed. So to check whether Python is installed in your PC or not, you have to type Python dash version in your command prompt. And if it is installed in your PC, then it will tell you which version of Python is installed in your PC. If it is not installed, you can follow these links. We will provide this PPT after the workshop. You can refer from here. For every type of OS, we have provided a video tutorial for how to install Python in your operating system. So Uh, first thing we would cover in Python is keywords in Python. Keywords are special types of names that are used by Python beforehand. Like we cannot use them in writing our code or declaring any variables. It is already used by Python for specific functionality. Here are list of some keywords like false, none, true, continue. Some of these are also common with C++ and C. You must have seen them. So going to next. Next is identifiers in Python. Identifiers are user-defined names that we use to represent variables, classes, function, modules. Like here, mm, the name is a identifier, and it is having a string value that is pi bits. And my identifier is also a type of identifier that has copied the content of identifier name. So these are called identifiers. These store the different types of data types. So next we will talk about variables and data types. Variables are containers that stores data values. uh, we gives names to different types of data and you store them in variables. So here below, like if we have to store value 4 in x, then here x works as a variable and the type of variable is int. And if we store a string named as Sally in X. X will be a variable of data type str. Str is string. So we will cover all these types of data types one by one. So first data types are in Python is numeric. Numeric mainly contains three type of sub data types: integers, floats, and complex numbers. Integers simply contain integer values, like x has value 10. It can be negative also, so same as the integer we know. And decimals have decimal values after the point. And if we would print the type of y, it would return float. So mainly in Python or any programming language, the decimal type of data types are called as float. So if we would print the type of y, it would return class as float. And the next is complex numbers. In Python, we can also declare complex numbers. So the iota part is represented by j, and here we can write it as z is equals to 10 plus 15j, where 15 will be the imaginary part and 10 will be the real part. So next data type we would cover is string. String is like strings are used to represent characters, alphabets, a group of alphabets, words, and sentences. So you can declare string by using single quotes and double quotes both. To access the value of string, we can use indexes. Indexes starts from 0 and are up to the end of the string, the length of the string minus 1. So name, like as shown here, name is equals to Python. We use single quotes here, and course equals to introduction to Python. Space are also included is in this string. So Python can handle spaces too. If we print the type of name, it will return class as str, and same for the string course too. We can access the character at the position 5 by writing the index in square brackets in the data type string course. So this is about string. Now coming to booleans in Python. The value of booleans is either true or false based on the logical value of expression. If we would assign a logical value to a variable in Python, it would be either true or false depending on the logical value. So as shown here, if we write 100 is greater than 10 and assign this value to a variable boolean, as we can see this is true. So true value will be stored in boolean. And if we print the value of boolean, so it will be true and the class will be bool as shown here. Output is on the right side. We can also print the boolean values by writing the expression in print statement itself, like 100 equal to 10. This is a false statement, so we would have output as false. Some miscellaneous things like the boolean value of any empty data type or empty string is false, and if we would write anything other than leaving it as empty, the boolean value of it will be true. So next we would cover list in Python. Lists are used to store multiple items in a single variable. They are like arrays in C and C++, but the data type of different element in list need not to be same. They can be different also. So lists are ordered, unchangeable, and allow duplicate values. I will explain one by one these things. Ordered means that we cannot the the elements in the list are ordered in certain arrangement. We cannot change them. They are not changed by their own. So we can change the values by accessing the index, but the order is fixed and cannot be changed by the list itself. We will see in sets and other sorted data types that the order can be changed depending on the magnitude of the value. It is not uniform, can have values of different data types. As shown here, my list is a list variable and it has six integer type values, then a string type value. So we can have different types of data types element in a single list. List can be declared by using square brackets and writing the elements in them. We can use the append keyword to append different elements in a list. List items are also indexed. You can access any value by using the indexing. Like as shown here, if we print my list and assign the index to, it will print 30 as 30 is present at index 2. So next type of container or data type in Python is tuple. Tuple is another collection in which all the elements are ordered, but here they are unchangeable. We cannot alter any value in a tuple. As tuple, there are many types of functions and operations that we can perform on tuple. We have covered two of the operations. Other operations can also be found on other resources found on internet. So first, if we use the operation count, it will return the frequency of the element that we have to find. Like here I declared my tuple as a tuple, so it is having these values. So if I print the type of my tuple, it will return class as tuple, and len is a keyword used to find the length of any container in Python. Like if we put my tuple in brackets and uh, uh, we have to find length of the tuple, we have to use this type of print statement and it will return the length of the tuple. If we have to access any value, then we can put the index in the square brackets and it will return the value at that position in our tuple. And here I have shown how mytuple.count can be used. If we write mytuple.count 50, it will return the frequency, how many times 50 is present in our tuple. So we can also use index mytuple.index20. It will return the index at which 20 value is present. So as 20 is present at index 1, it will print index 1 as shown here. Here also in tuple also the data type of each element can be of different kind, same as list. Now coming to sets. Sets are unordered collection of items. Every set element is unique. In list and tuples, duplicate elements are allowed, but in sets, duplicate elements are not allowed, and sets are all sorted. Like if we uh, if we insert 35 in this set, it will already be stored in between 30 and 40. So they are stored in sorted order. A set is created by placing curly braces separated by commas or using built-in set function. Like if as shown here, my set is a type of set container in Python that we have initialized using the curly braces and put three elements in them in it, 1 comma 2 comma 3, and if we would print it, it would return same as this. Set can also have different types of elements, different data types of elements. Like here, the first element is a float, the second element is a string, and the third element is a tuple. One thing is that sets cannot have list and dictionaries as their elements. Other types of data types are allowed, but list and dictionaries are not allowed as elements of set. The next comes dictionary. Python dictionaries is an ordered collection of items, and each elements of dictionary has key and value pairs. Dictionary are like maps in C++. We have to provide a key and the dictionary will get us the value. If we compare it with list have indexes. If we want to find the value of index 0, we can find it in list, but in dictionaries there are keys. So there are key and value pairs. Each key is mapped to certain value. An item has a key and corresponding value that is expressed as a pair, key and value. Since the keys are unique, we use key as indexes to access the values in dictionary. Every value has a unique key and we can access the value using the key. Dictionary is created by placing key value pair inside curly braces separated by commas. Below here, I have shown how the declaration of dictionary is done. We can declare dictionary by using curly braces and providing key and value pair. Like key1 is a key and the value is pi bits, and 2 is a key and the value is Python. We can access the value by writing the key in curly braces. Like if we have to print the value corresponding to key1, we can write it like this, and this will return pi bits as our output. We can also use get to write the key in it. These two will have same functionality. So we have completed the data types in Python. Next, we will cover the operators in Python. Operators are used to perform operations on the variables. Like the variables we have discussed so far. To perform operation on them, we use the Python operators. Below is the list of different operators that are present in Python. First is arithmetic, then assigned, comparison, logical, identity, membership, and bitwise operators. We will cover all of them one by one. So first, coming to arithmetic operators, these are pretty straightforward. The addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, modulus, floor division, and exponentiation. The first four are easily understood by this example. Like if we have two variable x and y, we can of integer type, we can add them using the plus operator in Python. Similarly, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Modulus operation returns the remainder when x is divided by y. If we divide x by y, the remainder will be returned using modulus operator. Floor division will return the division that result into whole number adjusted to the left in the number line. Like if we divide 5 by 2, we would have 2.5. If we convert it in floor, it will return 2. So floor division returns the division that result into the whole number adjusted left to the number line. Exponentiation, it will give the left operand raised to the power of right. If I write x star star y, it would return x to the power y. Like if x would x have the value 2 and y have the value 5, so 2 to the power 5, 32 will be returned by this operation. Below is the code implementation of arithmetic operators. You can refer them. Next is comparison operators. Comparison operators usually returns true and false values that are the logical value of the expression. They are same as we have studied in our schools. Like this is greater than symbol, this is less than, this is double equals to is equivalent to comparing those values equality. So if we have to compare the value of x and y are equal or not, we can place double equals to in them, and this will return true if x and y both have same value. Otherwise, it will return false. Similarly, not equals to is inverse of double equals to. So next is greater than equals to and less than equals to. These are same as greater equals to greater than and less than. Just equals to condition is also involved in it. Here is the code implementation of all the comparison operators. You can refer them after the workshop. Next is the logical operators. These are used to combine two different types of logical operations. Like if x is a boolean type of variable that has value true and y is a boolean variable that has a value false, we can use x and y to find that the if we take AND operation of x and y, what would it return? So this would return false. So here the output is false. X or Y, as one value is true, so OR operation will be performed and the output will be true. Not X will be the inverse of X. So X is value true, so the output value will be false as we have performed the not operation. Mm, Next is a bit important operator, that is bitwise operator. Bitwise operator is used to perform operation on the binary representation of numbers. If we have a number like 10, then and we have to perform operation on it, so we on the binary representation on it, so we would use bitwise operators. So uh, and will help us to perform the bitwise AND of the two values. Let us take x as 10. So the binary representation of 10 will be like this, and the binary representation of y that has value 4 will be like this. So if we perform AND operation on it, so we would have 2. And you can see from here, if we perform bitwise AND operation on these two binary numbers, we would have value 2. Similarly, bitwise OR will perform the OR operation on individual bits and return the final integer that we would get. So we got 14. Bitwise NOT will return the not of the value, and the last bit of this number, that is 0, will be inverted. So the sign of this binary number will be inverted. So we would have -11. And similarly, XOR operation, the last two operation is left shift and right shift. This will be covered in number theory in the further part of this workshop. So next is the assignment operator. The simple equals to will assign the value to any variable, like as shown here. Plus equals to will be equivalent to x equals to x plus 5. This will increment the value of x by 5 and then assign this value to x itself. And the other type of assignment operators are minus equals to, multiply equals to. So this would work in the same fashion as plus equals to. just the operation here in between x and that number will be changed, and the final value will be assigned to x itself. This types of operations cover same operators like arithmetic operators as we have covered earlier. So next, there are some special operators. First is identity operators. So is and is not are identity operators in Python. These are used to check if two values or variables are located on the same part of the memory. Two variables that are equal does not imply that they are identical. So if we assign x1 a value of 5 and y1 a value of 5 and print x1 is not y1, so in Python if we assign same variable to same value to different variables, they will have same location in memory. See, this is different from C++, but Python follows this type of assignment only. So x1 and y1 has same memory, same location in the memory. So if we put operator is not in between them, so this will return false as they share same memory location. And x2 is y2 as they both have same value hello, so they would share same memory location, so x2 is y2 would return true. Next type of special operator is membership operator. Membership operator is used to test whether a value or variable is found in a sequence or not. For example, if we have a list and it has some value, so we can check that a particular value is present in a list or not using the in and not in operator. Like if we have a dictionary y that has key value pair 1 comma a and 2 comma b, so we can check is 1 is present in y or not. So this would return true as key 1 is present in y. This operation cannot be performed on values. Like if we write a is present in y, it would return false because when it comes to dictionary, it only checks the key in the dictionary. The values remain untouched. Uh, Similarly, if x is a string like hello world, and we have to check whether character capital H is present in x or not, so we can simply write it as capital H in x, and it would return true only. Next, we have if, elif, and else statement. These are similar to C and C++. So if we would write a condition and after and surround it by brackets and write if in the starting, this would cover a if condition. So in a if statement, the if the condition in the circular brackets is true, the statement block below it will be executed. So in the below example, if the score in theory is 50 and score in practical is 55, and we would and if we add them and it if it is greater than 100, this if this print statement will be executed, and if it is false, then this statement will not be executed. Here, since the value is 105 on adding these two values, and it is greater than equals to 100, so this if statement is true, and this print statement will be executed. We can also nest these if conditions as per our requirement. If Python also has if, elif, and else statements. If in this type of statements, If the first condition 1 is true, if statement will be executed. If not, the condition 2 will be checked, and if this is true, then indent block condition 2 will be executed, and if this is also false, then the else statement will be executed. These are used to specify some conditions according to our requirement. Note note here that indentation plays a crucial role in Python. As in other languages, curly braces and brackets are used for this purpose. But in Python, to make it more easy to write and understand, more understandable, Python support indents, not brackets. So you have to be extra careful of the indentations, like the uh, the statement block of if statement must be indented after the if statement. Next, we would cover loops in Python. Loops is used to iterate over sequence that is either a list, a tuple, a dictionary, a set, or a string. There are mainly two types of loops, while loops and for loops. Let's say in an example, we have a fruit as a list, and it has value apple, banana, and cherry. If we have to iterate over this list, we can use for loop, and the syntax is like for x in fruits. So here x will one by one take all the values in the list in order. So if we run the for loop, and after the indentation we print x, so apple, banana, and cherry will be received in our output. Similarly, for writing using it in integer like index, so we can use it like this for I in range 0 to len of fruit, comma 1. So this will start from 0, will go up to len of fruit minus 1. The last value in the range value is not covered. So, and the shift will be of 1 unit only. And if we would print fruits of I, apple, banana, and cherry will be printed as it was printed in the previous example. While loops, while loop syntax are is as while we have to write while. After that, a condition follows, and this while loop will continue to run until this condition is true. As shown here, if we initialize the value of I as 1, and in the condition of while statement we have written I less than 6, and we are printing the value of I until this loop runs, and incrementing the value of I by 1. So first the value of I will be 1, then it will be 2, 3, 4, 5. After 5, this will exceed 6. This will be I will have value 6, and this condition will be false. So the while loop will break. We can also intentionally break the while loop using if statement, and under the if statement we can write the break. So break will break this while loop. Break statement can also be used in for loops depending on our requirement. Next, and one of the most important topic in Python is functions. Function is a block of code which runs only when it is called. You can pass data known parameters into the function. So in the example shown here, we first define a function. Def means we are defining a function, and my function is the name of that function. We provide some argument to that function. Here it is x. So this function is doing what it is doing is it is returning 5 into x. That is, we multiply 5 into x and we would return this value. So here uh, we have called my function and passed the value 3 here. So x will have value 3, and we would return 5 into 3, which will be 15. So a would have value 15 as the return value of my function is stored in a, and if we would print the value of a, it would be 15. Here are some useful links where you can study in depth about Python. First is a YouTube link of Telescope. The second is of Corey Schaeffer's up to video number 15 only. And the third is the W3 Schools link. These are blogs where you can study about Python. For practice, highly recommend you to solve these problems and HackerRank. You could solve the easy level problem for now. This is up for Python. Next, number theory part will be covered by Saurav.
You must be visible.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm Saurabh from EC Part 3, and I will be covering the number theory part for this workshop. And basically, I will try to be as comprehensive as possible, but because we have some time constraint also, so we are going to skip also a few things which are like very obvious and are expected, like all of you are expected to do that already. And second, we will be looking at some theorems also, like very famous theorems, but we are not going to look at the proofs. Okay? But I highly encourage you guys to go back and look at the proofs after this workshop. So firstly, we will be studying modular arithmetic. So modular arithmetic is all about arithmetic that involves modulus operation. Okay. So what is modulus operation? So when we say A mod B, we basically mean to find out the remainder on dividing A by B. Okay. So for example, like if A is an integer and B is a positive integer, we define mod to be remainder when A is divided by B. So all of you guys must be already knowing about this operator. So we can always like if A mod B is equal to R, then we can always write A is equal to Q into B plus R, where Q is actually an integer. It's a non-negative integer. Okay. So where Q is equal to A by B, which is the greatest integer function. Okay. I think these are like pretty obvious things. And here we have some examples. If we calculate the value of 9 mod 2, we will get 1. Okay. Or 56 mod 11, that will be also 1. Okay. So let's look at some properties of modulus. So these are very intuitive and straightforward properties of modulus. The first one is commutative laws. Okay. So W plus X mod N is equal to X plus W mod N. Okay. And it holds true because we know that addition in itself is commutative. So it doesn't matter in which order you are adding them, you will always get the same output. The same holds true for multiplication also, but here there is a misprinting. It should be X into W. Means W into X mod N is equal to X into W mod N. Similarly, we have associative laws, distributive laws, identities, and additive inverse. Like identity is like a bit interesting. Okay, how do we define additive identity? Okay, we say that E is an additive identity if A plus E is equal to A. Okay, and we know for addition, this additive identity is zero because you add zero to any number, you will get the original number. Okay. Similarly, we can define additive modular identity. Okay, means A plus E mod n should be equal to A mod n. Okay, and the interesting thing here is that you do not have a unique additive modular identity. Okay, like 0 plus W mod n is W mod n. In fact, you could keep or you could take any multiple of n that would satisfy this property. Okay. Similarly, you have multiplicative modular identity. Okay, just like we have multiplicative identity, that is A into E is equal to A, means E is equal to 1, which is the multiplicative identity. Similarly, we have modular multiplicative identity because like one is one particular modular multiplicative identity, because if you multiply it with any number, you take it more, you take its mod, it will be same, like even if you do not multiply it with that particular number. Okay, and here also this is not unique. At the place of 1, even if you would have taken n plus 1 or 2n plus 1 or 3n plus 1, you still, you would still find this condition to hold true. So this is somewhat difference between the modular additive identities and like normal additive or multiplicative identities. So like in the later cases, they are unique, but for modular multiplicative, but for modulus, they are not unique. You have infinitely many additive identities or like modular additive identities or modular multiplicative identities. Similarly, we have additive inverse. Okay, like how do we define additive inverse? So we define it like W plus Z is congruent to 0 mod n. Okay, means like if you talk about normal additive inverse, we know that additive inverse of A is minus A, because when we add them, we get 0, which is the additive identity. So in similar, like on the similar lines, we can define modular additive inverse also. Next, we have some more properties of modular, which are like more important. Let me go back. So we have A plus B mod C is equal to A mod C plus B mod C mod C. Okay, it means that you can distribute this modulus operator inside. Okay, and like it is very easy to prove. Okay, you can all try to prove it on your own. It's actually very easy, and it's quite intuitive also. But one thing that is important to note here is, why is there an extra modulus here? Okay, I distributed it inside. I calculated A mod C. I calculated B mod C. I added them, and why am I taking the like its modulus with C once again? It's because if you look at the LHS, then the value of this particular expression should always lie between 0 to C minus 1. Okay, this comes from the definition of modulo. We are talking about the remainder. So the remainder should always lie between 0 to C minus 1. But if you look at the right hand side, it may happen that after you add A mod C and B mod C, this value may exceed C minus 1. Okay. So in order to make it equal to the left hand side, you have to take modulus again. So second is like somewhat here we are talking about multiplication. So A into B mod C is always equal to A mod C into B mod C mod C. Similarly, we have A minus B mod C. This is like somewhat different. Here we say A mod C minus B mod C plus C mod C. Okay, and why are we adding this extra C? Like even if you do not add the C, it is still mathematically valid. You can just subtract these two values and take their modulus again. But it can have some implementation problems, especially if you're using a language like C++, where there is some problem with the internal implementation of modulus. Okay, we all know that -1 mod 4 is 3. Okay, but if you will, if you will write this thing in C++, you will get 1, which is wrong. So it means that C++ is not able to handle the modulus of negative numbers. Okay, most of the times it gives wrong answer because of the way it has been internally implemented. Therefore, it is always advisable to always to firstly ensure that the operand, it is positive. So it is non-negative. So therefore, we are adding this C in order to make this operand non-negative, and then we take its modulus. For example, if I want to calculate -1 mod 4, what I can do is I will firstly add 4 to -1, that is 3. And then I take its mod with 4. So 3 mod 4, it is 3. Now this is the correct answer. In case of Python, it works completely fine even if you do not add the C. There, it like -1 mod 4 gives you 3 only. But in case of C++, there is some problem with it. The fourth one, which is for division, it's like a bit complicated. Okay, it's not like A by B mod C can be simply written as A mod C by B mod C. You can pick any value of A, B, C, and you can see that most of the time it doesn't hold true. So therefore, we actually define it in a different way. Okay, what we are going to do is we are going to replace this B by its modular inverse. Okay, multiplicative modular inverse. B raised to the power -1. Okay, it is like we have written it as B raised to the power of -1, but it is not the normal B raised to the power of -1, which we identify as 1 by B. Okay, we will see how to be calculated, what is its definition in the later part of this workshop. And we basically replace it by its modular inverse and replace this division operator by multiplication operator. And then it, like from division problem, it becomes a multiplication problem, and it can be dealt in like similar way, like the way we saw how to deal with multiplication in the second point. So we will come on this later, how to calculate multiplicative modulo inverse, and there are some conditions also which need to be followed. Only then this is defined. We will see those things in the later part of the workshop. So here we have like some simple examples. Like we say 5 plus 3 mod 2. Okay, so one way of calculating is this is to firstly add 5 and 3, you get 8. 8 mod 2 is 0. The other way is to bring this mod 2 inside, like what we studied in the first formula. Okay, so you can also write it as 5 mod 2 plus 3 mod 2 mod 2, which is like 1 plus 1 mod 2 is equal to 0. Now, this congruence modulo, it is like sort of more or definition like thing. And what does it actually mean? Okay, we say A is congruent to B mod C if A mod C is equal to B mod C. Okay, let me bring my notepad over. Can you guys see the notepad? Is the notepad visible to you all?
No.
No, भैया.
No, yeah.
Is the notepad visible now?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, भैया.
Okay. So I don't know how to make that 3 equal to sign, but whenever we say this, we basically mean that A mod n is equal to B mod n. Okay. For example, 2 is this is actually not equal. This we have different symbol to represent it. It is written as 2 congruent to, which actually is like 3 dashes. So it is equal to 3 8 mod 6, or you can write it as 6. Okay. Why? Because we know that 2 mod 6 is equal to 8 mod 6. In fact, if we consider any set like this, C plus 1 or 2C plus 1, 3C plus 1, all these numbers, they all are congruent modulo C. Why? Because if you pick up any two numbers, if you pick any number, you take its modulo with respect to C, you will get remainder 1. Okay, therefore, all these numbers, they are congruent modulo 1. Okay. Now I think that the slides will be visible, so I will go back to the previous setting. Okay, are the slides visible now?
Yes.
Yes.
So here we have like this via this diagram also we wanted to show the same thing, like all the numbers like C plus 1, 2C plus 1, 3C plus 1, these numbers lie on the same line because they are congruent modulo C. Okay. You take modulo of any number with C, you will get 1, and like for this number you get 0, and like pretty straightforward. So now let's talk about some basic properties of congruences. Uh, so we say that two, like this first actually defines what is the meaning of congruent modulo n. It means that if A mod n is equal to B mod n, then we write A is congruent to B mod n. Okay. And the second is that if A is congruent to B mod n, n always divides A minus B. Okay. So it happens because we know that A and B, they give the same remainder when divided by n. So if you divide them and then you divide it by n, you know, this remainder has got cancelled. Now the remainder you will be getting on dividing A minus B by n is 0. So therefore we say that n divides A minus B. It is symmetric, means A congruent to B is like it has the same meaning, that is B congruent to A. And it is transitive also, you know, it is true because this means that A mod n is equal to B mod n, and get the highlight. So it is transitive because this thing means A mod n is equal to B mod n. This means B mod n is equal to C mod n. So yeah, because of these two relations, automatically A mod n will be equal to C mod n. So we can say that A is congruent to C mod n. On similar lines, we have like some other things also. Okay, you can check out them later. Now let's come on more important things like modular exponentiation. So first of all, we all know what is exponentiation. Okay, x raised to the power n is nothing but the product of x taken n times. Okay? And several times we are interested in finding out x raised to the power n modulus m. Okay? And one way of doing is to definitely firstly evaluate the value of x raised to the power n, and then we take the modulus m. Okay? But it is not always feasible, especially if you are using a programming language like C++, where the primitive data types are not big enough to store very large numbers. So there you have to think of a different approach, okay, in order to calculate x raised to the power n mod n, okay. And this Python code, actually, it basically follows the same way, okay, how to calculate x raised to the power n mod n. So what we are going to do is we are going to break this problem in smaller parts. Like if I have x raised to the power n, I will take out one x from it and I will calculate the value of x raised to the power n minus 1, and then we multiply them. Okay. And at each step, I will keep taking mod m. Okay. So that there is no overflow. Okay. It's like the normal way, the usual way we calculate 2 to the power anything or 3 to the power anything. Okay, we firstly calculate 3, then we multiply it with the 3 again, we get 3 square, we multiply it with the 3 again, we get 3 cube. So we are doing the same thing, but we are doing it in a reverse order. Like if you want to calculate 3 raised to the power n, we are saying that it is equal to 3 into 10 power 3 into 3 power 9. So let's focus on 3 into 3 power 9. So we calculate the value of 3 power 9, and then we multiply it with 3, and we keep taking the modulo at every step. Talking about the time complexity, because you see that like in each function call, the exponent is reducing by 1. So therefore, this function, like, it will be called a total n number of times. So therefore, its time complexity is O of n. But this approach is like really very slow. Okay, for example, if you have very big exponents, then it is like not possible for you to use this method in order to calculate modular exponentiation. So therefore, we have a faster way of doing it, and it is called binary modular exponentiation. And the idea is very straightforward here. Let's take up an example. For example, let's say we want to calculate the value of 2 raised to the power 100. Okay. Forget mod 7 for once. Okay. That is not like important. It's firstly important to understand what is the logic or what is the main idea behind binary modular exponentiation. So let's say we want to calculate 2 raised to the power 100. We can write it as 2 raised to the power 50 into 2 raised to the power 50. So I have divided the exponent by 2. Okay. I have written this in the form of product of two numbers. Okay. So if I calculate 2 raised to the power 50, I will take its square and it will give me the value of 2 power 100. Okay. So now I have a smaller problem. Okay. A very small problem, which is 2 raised to the power 50. Here the exponent has been reduced to half. Okay. So if you would be using naive approach for this one, you would be calling that function 100 times. But if you calculate 2 raised to the power 50, you will be calling that function like 50 times. And then you have this like multiple. And here we are not going to call this function again. We can simply store it and we can just take the square of it. Okay. So in this way, you see, we were able to, reduce it to half, reduce the number of times the function was called to half. In fact, we can go on even further. Okay, 2 raised to the power 50 can be also written as 2 raised to the power 25 into 2 raised to the power 25. Okay, so we would calculate 2 raised to the power 25. We would square them to get 2 power 50, and we would square them again to get 2 power 100. And at each step, we will keep on taking modulus. Okay, this comes from the multiplication modular property that we saw. Like, how do we calculate a into b mod m? Okay, it's equal to a mod m into b mod m mod m. Okay, so we calculated 2 power 50. We take its modulus with 7. We square it or like multiply it with 2 power 50 mod 7, and then take mod again. But this is working because the exponent is even. Therefore, we are able to take its half every time. What if the exponent is not even and it's odd? Like here we have 2 raised to the power 101. So in that case, we will firstly make the exponent even. So I will take out a 2 as common, and we have 2, and I write it as 2 power 50 into 2 power 50. So I will evaluate the value of 2 power 50, and I will multiply it with, like, I will take its square, and then we will multiply it with 2. Okay. So I think it was clear. So here I have written the code for it. Okay, the Python code. The base case is when the exponent is 0. Okay, we know, and you take up any number, you you say, what is that? Like you take any number x, you know x raised to the power 0 is 1. So this is the base case. Whenever the exponent is 0, you simply can return 1. If the exponent is even, what you do is you calculate the value of x raised to the power n by 2. Okay, and then you take its square. Okay, and you return this value. Uh, it is in the lines of the thing, exactly what we did here. We calculated 2 raised to the power 50, we multiplied with itself and took its modular. So we are doing exactly the same thing here. We calculated x raised to the power n by 2, and we are then multiplying it with itself and returning the answer mod. If it is not the case, if the exponent is odd, what we do is we will separate out one x, and we will be left with n power minus 1, okay, which is even. So therefore, I can calculate x raised to power n minus 1 by 2. Okay, so this where is nothing, it is x raised to power n minus 1 by 2. And if we multiply it together, we will get the value of x raised to the power n minus 1. And if we once again multiply it with x, then we would get x raised to the power n. Okay. So it was actually one approach, one particular method of understanding binary modular exponentiation. There is a different approach also, which is like easier to implement, and it is like more intuitive. And it basically is like, you can define it in a different way. Like let's say you want to calculate 2 raised to the power 100. Rather than writing it as 2 raised to the power 50 into 2 raised to the power 50, what you can do is you can write it as 4 raised to the power 50. Okay, so if the exponent is even, what we will do is we will take the square of the base and the exponent will be reduced to half. Okay, like if we want to calculate 2 power 100, it is equivalent to finding out 4 to the power 50. Or if you want to find out 4 to the power 50, it is equivalent to 16 to the power 25. Okay, and we can keep going on. If the exponent is odd, what we do is we make it even by taking out one factor from it, and then it's like the same thing. We calculate x raised to the power x square raised to the power n minus 1 by 2. We multiply it with x and we return mod. So what is the time complexity for this approach? The time complexity is log of n, and it's actually log base 2n. Okay, why? Because at every step we are dividing the exponent by 2. Okay, so we are getting a sort of GP where the common ratio is 1 by 2. Okay, so after how many terms the exponent will become 0 or it will become 1, that will be of the order log of n base 2. So that was all about modular arithmetic. Now we will talk about GCD, which is greatest common divisor. We have been studying about this since long. Okay. So we say that if we have two numbers a and b, and both of them are like not zero, means at least one of them is non-zero, and the largest integer d says that d divides a and b divides b, is called the greatest common divisor of a and b. Okay. And it is like usually represented as GCD of a comma b. Okay. For example, we know that GCD of 8 comma 10, it is 2, because 2 is the largest number that divides both 8 and 10. Or we have GCD of 6 comma 9 is 3. Okay. Then we have like some special cases. Okay, like some definitions. What are co-prime numbers? So two numbers which have GCD equal to 1, they are called co-prime. Okay. For example, like 10 and 11, they are co-prime. Or you may take 9 and 16, they are also co-prime. They do not have any, their GCD is 1. Okay, that's why they are co-prime. And relatively prime also means the same thing. Okay, whether you say like 8 and 15 are co-prime or they're relatively prime, it means exactly the same thing. It's just one way of calling co-prime numbers. Okay, so if anyone has any sort of doubt, then they can interrupt me. So because we have a time constraint, therefore I am moving a bit fast. But if you face problem anywhere, if you have any sort of doubt, then feel free to interrupt me in bit. So now we saw what was GCD. So let's talk about the algorithm to calculate GCD. Okay, we have two numbers A and B. How can I calculate the GCD of two numbers? Okay. So like if we talk about the naive approach, which is like the most straightforward approach, then it is like we will start from we know this thing. If you are taking the GCD of a comma b, it's always going to lie from 1 to minimum of a comma b. Minimum of a comma b means the smaller one out of these two numbers. Okay. Of course, the GCD can't be greater than the smaller one of them. Otherwise, it won't be able to divide. Okay. Therefore, what we will do is we will start from the minimum of a comma b. We will go up to 1, and like this is the for loop in Python. We are starting from m. We will go to 1. This 0, like one more than that. We will go to 1, and we are decrementing it by 1. Okay. So we write it like this: range of m comma 0 comma minus 1. And for each of them, we will be checking whether they simultaneously divide a and b or not. If we find any such number which divides both a and b simultaneously, we will say it is the GCD. Okay, and we will return from here. And if you are not able to find any such number, of course, one divides all the numbers. So eventually this function will be terminating at I equal to 1. What is the time complexity? The time complexity is minimum of a comma b, because in worst case, you will have to go down like all the way from n to 1. Okay. So therefore the time complexity is O of minimum of a comma b. Okay. So now we have a different algorithm for the same thing, which is like quite fast, very fast than like far more fast than the naive approach that we studied. And this is Euclid's algorithm, and we all have been using this algorithm like for general mathematical purpose. So it is based on this theorem. Okay, that is GCD of a comma b is equal to GCD of b comma r, where r is equal to a mod b. Okay, so it also has a very simple proof. We are not going to look at the proof, but you can find its proof in any standard textbook on number theory or algebra or like at any site. So, so here we have got a sort of recursive relation, and we have like written exactly the same thing. We have implemented the same thing through Python. Okay, and there is a base case, that is if one of them is 0, like b is equal to 0, then we will return a. Okay, so by definition, GCD of a comma 0 is a. Okay, so this is the base case. Whenever b is 0, we will simply return a. So this is the point at which our function is terminating. Okay, or this is will be the last one. Otherwise, we will call GCD of b comma a mod b. Okay. So it is on the lines of this theorem that we studied. Okay. And the time complexity of it is log of minimum of a comma b, and it is like somewhat complicated to prove that this is like the time complexity of it. So if you are winning, you can check out it, but it's a bit complicated. So here we have some examples like let's try to calculate the GCD of 16 comma 10 using Euclid's algorithm. So, we use this recursive relation. So the first argument, A, will be replaced by B, and the second argument will be A mod B. Means GCD 16 comma 10 is equal to GCD of 10 comma 16 mod 10, or GCD of 10 comma 6. And GCD of 10 comma 6 will be equal to GCD of 6 comma 4. GCD of 6 comma 4 will be equal to GCD of 4 comma 2. And finally, you see that we get to the base value, which is when one of the arguments is 0. So GCD of 2 comma 0, and we know it is 2 by definition. So we can return from here. Now we have a very interesting thing which is called the extended Euclidean algorithm. Okay. Let me open my notepad. Okay, is the notepad is it visible?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is extended Euclidean algorithm? So there is a very simple theorem, that is GCD of a comma b. If it is equal to g, then we have an equation of this kind. I think like many of you guys might be already knowing about this. That if GCD of a comma b is equal to g, then there always exists integral solutions for x and y. Okay. So if GCD is a comma b is equal to g, then we always have integral solutions for ax plus by equals to g. Okay. And Euclidean extended algorithm is all about finding out these values. Okay, x and y. Okay, In reality, there are like infinitely many solutions for this equation. And if you are able to find out even one, even if you are able to find one pair, then using that you can find out all the possible solutions. Okay. So in Euclidean extended algorithm, we basically try to find out, or it actually finds out the value of x and y. Okay, one particular x and y, one particular solution of x and y. So the main idea is that GCD of a comma b we know is equal to GCD of b comma a mod b. Okay. Now, if GCD and they all are equal to g, so just like ax plus by equals to g, for this particular expression also, I can write somewhat similar thing. I can say bx1 plus a mod b times y1 is equal to g. Okay. So, and I can, simplify it even a bit further. A mod b is always equal to b times a by b. This is the greatest integer function, or you can call it even floor. And this is y1 is equal to g. And now I will bring all the similar coefficients together. So we have a plus y1, and you can take out b as common. So you get x1 minus a by b y1. Okay, this is equal to g. Okay, so let's remove this and compare these two equations. So if you compare these two equations, you see that the coefficients are same. Therefore, what we get that x is equal to y1 and y is equal to x1 minus a by b y1. Okay. So why is this relation useful? Okay, we even do not know the value of x1 and y1. So why is it useful? So basically, we have been able to find out a recursive relation between between x and x1 and y and y1. Okay. And so what we will do is we will basically break down this problem into smaller subproblems. Okay. So rather than calculating x and y, I will try to calculate the value of x1 and y1. And if I get to know the value of x1 and y1, then using this these two recursive relations, I can find out the value of x and y. Okay. So how does it happen? So we know that GCD of a comma b is equal to GCD of b of like a mod b, and you can like keep going like this, and in the end you will get something like this. Okay, this is the point where our Euclidean algorithm it terminates. So we will at last step we will get this. Okay, that is GCD of g comma 0. Okay, and we know, let's say that g of xn, for it also we will this equation will hold true, but a will be g and b will be 0, and x will be xn and y will be yn. So this is like 0 times yn is equal to g. And here, like this is pretty straightforward. Okay, this is something that can be solved easily. No matter what value you keep in yn, this is not going to matter because we will get a 0 over here. It's being multiplied with 0. So xn is equal to 1, and yn, you could keep any value over here, but normally we keep it 0. Okay. So we have been able to find out x and yn, and now using x and yn, we can like back propagate. Means we can calculate the value of xn minus 1, yn minus 1, and we can just keep going backwards, and finally in this way we will get the value of x comma y. So Euclidean algorithm is all about this only. Like it is a sort of, it breaks the original problem into smaller subproblem. It finds the value of x and yn, and then it evaluates the value of x comma y for the previous equations that we had. And it is all based on these two recursive relations that we just derived. So So here we have code for it. Okay, I think Python code is like better to easier to understand. So the base case is when p is equal to b is equal to 0. It was like what I discussed as g comma 0. We in that case return 1 comma 0. Okay, and what we are like in general case, what we are doing is we are solving the same problem for like smaller arguments. We are solving it for b comma a mod b, and we evaluate x1 comma y1 in this way, and then we use these two recursive relations in order to calculate the value of x and y, and we return x comma y. This is the C++ implementation of it. The time complexity is like the same as of the Euclidean algorithm, okay, because we are doing a somewhat similar thing. So therefore, its time complexity is also going to be log of minimum of a comma b. So now comes a modular multiplicative inverse, something like which we discussed in the like which we encountered in the very starting of this number theory part, but we said that okay we will come on it later. So finally the point has come when we actually will be understanding what is modular multiplicative. So we say that B is modular multiplicative inverse of A if A into B mod M is equal to 1. Okay. So if this condition holds true, then we say that B is the modular multiplicative inverse of A. Okay. And further, we have a condition, and the condition is modular multiplicative inverse exists if and only if it should be when A and M are co-prime. That is GCD of A comma M is 1. Okay. So if M and A are not co-prime, then the modular multiplicative inverse doesn't exist. Okay. This can be also proven very easily, and I'm going to show you the proof of it because this is important. Okay? It's important because the complete calculation of modular multiplicative inverse like depends upon is follows the same track. So what we have is we say A into B mod M is equal to 1. Okay. We want to prove that there is a solution for this only if there is a solution for B only if A and M are co-prime. So let's assume that GCD of A comma M is equal to some G. Then I can write A as Gx and B as Gy. Okay, where X and Y are two arbitrary co-prime integers. Like GCD of X comma Y should be known. Now what I will do is I can say A into B is equal to some integer P multiplied by M plus 1. Okay. So I will replace A. Sorry, this should be M. I will replace A by Gx and M by Gy. Okay, so we say A is equal to Gxb and it is equal to Gy P plus 1. Okay, plus 1. Now, if you bring it to the left hand side, you get G xb minus yp is equal to 1. Okay. Now, if you focus at this equation, that is G into xb comma y, xb minus yp, it is like very easy to understand that it will hold true only if uh, only if G is equal to 1 and xb minus yp is equal to 1. Only if these two things hold true simultaneously, only then we will be able to solve this equation. By solving this equation, I mean to say we will be able to evaluate B and P, which are the two unknown variables over here. So eventually we have been able to prove that this G is always going to be 1. Only then this expression is going to hold true, and it means that X is nothing but it's A, and and Y is also nothing but it's M. Okay. So let's look at this equation. This equation is like key to finding out the value of P. So we know X is equal to A. So we have AB minus what is Y? Y is equal to M. So we have this equation AB minus MP, and we want to solve this equation. Rest of the things I can remove. And we want to solve this equation, that is AB minus MP, okay, in order to find B, which is the modular multiplicative inverse of A. And how can we do that? Okay, so we know that GCD of A comma M is equal to 1. Okay, so using Euclidean extended algorithm, I know that I can find out the solution of this equation. Okay, I can find out the value of x and y satisfying this equation. That is ax plus my is equal to 1. And if you compare these equations, what you get that uh, b is equal to x and p is equal to minus y. Okay. So p is definitely not useful. We just wanted to know the value of p. So we have been able to find out the method of finding the modular multiplicator. What we all have to do is we have to take a and m. We have to take a and m. We actually need to apply the Euclidean extended algorithm on it to find out the value of x and y. and the modular multiplicative inverse for A with respect to M is going to be X. Okay. And we are not going to return X alone. Like we will not say that X itself is the modular multiplicative inverse. Why? Because by definition, modular multiplicative inverse is a positive quantity and it should lie in the range of 0 to M minus 1. But when we apply this Euclidean algorithm, extended algorithm to find out the value of X and Y, there is no guarantee that the X and Y that we are getting will be in that particular region of definition. So we have to perform just like simple mathematical manipulation on it. That is X mod M plus M mod N. And this is finally the modular inverse of B. Okay. If anyone has any doubt here in this particular part, then they can ask me. I can explain it again. Okay, so let's continue. So here you see we have okay. Are you able to see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay. So here is this Python and C++ function to calculate mod inverse. So what we are doing is we are calling the extended Euclidean algorithm that we have already declared. We calculate X and Y and we return X mod N plus M mod M. Okay. And exactly the same thing has been done in C++ also. Now we come on Fermat's little theorem. It is like a very interesting, like it's a very useful algorithm. And what this algorithm states that a raised to the power p minus 1 is congruent to 1 mod p. Okay, or it simply means that a raised to the power p minus 1 mod p is equal to 1. And what is a and what is p? So a is any normal number, normal integer. P is a prime, but we have a condition that is GCD of a and p should be 1. Means a and p are co-prime. So whenever a and p are co-prime and p is a prime, then a raised to the power p minus 1 always gives remainder 1 when divided by p. Okay. So we will see like it is quite useful in cryptography and it is also like used for non-deterministic primality testing. We will see what does it mean later. Okay. And this one, like this also has a very simple proof, but we are not going to cover it here. You can check for it. So first of all, I would like to tell you that Fermat's little theorem can be used to find out modular multiplicative inverse too. Okay. Why? Because a raised to the power p minus 1 gives modulo 1 when divided by p. Okay. So you see, I can write this a into p power minus a raised to the power p minus 1 as a into a raised to the power p minus 2. Okay. So a raised to the power p minus 2 in a way is acting as the modular inverse of a. Okay. Because when we multiply a with a raised to the power p minus 2 and we take its modulo with p, we get 1. So a raised to the power p minus 2 is actually the modular multiplicative inverse of a. But remember, this thing like this approach can't be used always. It can be used only in the case when this mod, okay, with respect to which you are finding the multiplicative inverse, it's prime. Okay. If it is not prime, then you can't do it. Okay. Then you will have to use that Euclidean extended algorithm to evaluate the modular multiplicative inverse. But in most of the cases, you will see that the mod value that is given to us, one very famous value is 10 to the power 9 plus 7. It is a prime. So then whenever in those cases, whenever you have to find out the modular multiplicative inverse, you can simply use the Fermat's little theorem. Like by Fermat's little theorem, I mean to say that you just calculate the value of a raised to the power p minus 2 mod p. And you do not have to use Euclidean extended algorithm to calculate modular multiplicative inverse. Now comes very interesting topic, which is like prime number. So we all know what prime numbers are. Okay, prime numbers have only divisor 1 in itself. Okay, like for example 2, 3, 5, 7. These are some very famous prime numbers, And another very famous prime number is 10 to the power 9 plus 7. So these are some prime numbers, whereas 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, this is not a prime number. Like 4 is not a prime number because it's divisible by 2. 6 is a prime number, not a prime number because it's divisible by 2 and 3. Okay, whereas a prime number should be divisible by only 1 and itself. Okay, whereas it doesn't hold true for these numbers, therefore they are not prime. So here we have the list of prime numbers which are like less than 200. Okay, like it is not for the purpose of memorization. It's just in order to show that like what is the general distribution of numbers, okay, or general distribution of prime numbers. But but of course the distribution of prime numbers from 1 to 200 is like quite different from what we expect for bigger numbers. Now comes a very important topic, which is primality testing. Okay, so given the number, we want to determine if it is prime or not. How can we do that? So, like the most simple method is to start from 2 and go up to half of that number and check if there is any number in that particular range which divides that number. If you are able to find out one such number, then it means that it is not prime. Okay, and if you are not able to find any number in that particular range, then we say that it's a prime. Okay, but it's quite slow. Okay, its prime complexity will be of O of n if n is the number that we have initially. There is a faster method of doing it, and as per that method, you actually do not have to go up to the half of that number. You just have to go to the square root of that number. Like if you have some number n, you will start from 2 and will go only till square root of n. And if in that particular region you are not able to find out any factor of p, then it is a prime. And it holds true because 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 of like very simple reason. Like if we have any number p, and let's say we can denote it as x into y. So x and y, they can't be simultaneously, both of them can't be simultaneously greater than square root of p. Otherwise, their product will give a number larger than p. Okay. So at least one of them is required to be less than equal to square root of p. Okay. It means that you take any number, always at least one of its factor, okay, will be it will be smaller than the square root or smaller than or equal to the square root of that number. So based on this idea, we say that actually we do not have to go up to the like to half. You just need to go to up to the square root of that number. And if in that region you are not able to find out any factor of it, then it means that there is no like that number is prime. Okay, so like this is for the naive algorithm that we discussed. Like we go all the way up to that number. In fact, here this is even worse. Here we are going up to n minus 1. Okay. This is that square root technique. Okay, rather than writing I into I less than equal to n, you could simply write I into less than equal to square root of n also in this condition of while loop. But eventually both of the things mean same. Okay, so we check that if up to this, like till this condition holds true, if we are able to find any number which divides n, then we say that okay, return false. It's not a prime number. And if you are not able to find, then it means that it's a prime. So we return true. Okay. Now there is another very useful technique of finding whether a number is prime or not, and that is sieve of Eratosthenes. Okay. So when do we use sieve of Eratosthenes? Okay, whenever we actually have to answer a lot of queries. Okay, and in each query we are being given a number, and we have to tell whether it's a prime or not. So then in those scenarios, you will be using sieve of Eratosthenes. Okay. And the main idea of sieve of Eratosthenes, like I will explain it via this diagram. So let's say that we know this thing that maximum number that can be given to us is n. Okay, like in all the queries, the maximum number that can be given to us is n. So what we do is we create an array of length n. Okay, and at each index we will it can be a boolean array or an integer array. We will say that we will initially mark all the numbers or all the indices as prime. Okay, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We initially mark them all as prime. Okay, now the algorithm starts. Okay, so firstly we will go on to we check if it's a prime or not. So we know that initially it was marked as prime, so it's a prime. So we will go on all the factors of 2. We go on 4, we go on 6, we go on 8, all the way to n, and we cancel them out. Okay, because 2 is a prime number, all of its all of its multiples, they can't be prime because they are divisible by 2. So I go to all the multiples of 2 and I mark them composite. Okay. Then I come on 3 and I check whether 3 is prime or not. So 3 is prime. Okay, it was marked initially as prime and it was not reached by 2. So therefore it's a prime. So we will do exactly the same thing for 3 also. We go on all its multiples. We go on 3, we go 6, we go on 9, we go on 12, we go on 15, and like this, and we mark them composite. Okay. Then we go on 4. Okay, we check whether 4 is prime or not. So no, 4 is not prime and it's a composite. So we are not going to do this exercise for 4. And why are we not going to do this exercise for 4? Because we know that there is a prime number smaller than 4 which divides 4. So it must have marked all the multiples of 4 also as composite. Like 2 marked 4 as composite, so it would have marked all the multiples of 4 also as composite. We know it marked 8 also, uh, it marked 12 also. So therefore, we are not going to do this exercise for composite numbers. So the main idea is and then we go on 5. We do exactly the same thing for 5. We check if 5 is prime or not. So 5 is prime. We go on its multiple, that is 10. We mark it non-prime or composite. We do the same thing for 15, like this. Okay. So in this way, we keep going on, and finally, after the termination, you basically will have true at all those prime locations, like at 3, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. You will have true over here. They will be unmarked, and all the numbers which are like composite, they will be marked composite. Okay. So this is sieve of those things. And here we like this is C++ code. We have got a Python code also for it, which like is in the very next slide. So what we are doing is we are declaring a Boolean array, okay, of size n plus 1, and we mark all of them true. By true, I mean to say all of them are prime initially. Okay, we are not interested in 0 and 1 because this prime definition doesn't hold true for them. So we are not interested in them. We will start from 2. What we do is we check if the number on which I'm currently present, if it is the prime, I go on all of its multiples. Now here it's an interesting thing. We are starting from I into I. Okay? We are not going to 2i, we are not going to 3i, we are directly starting to from I into I. And it's so because all the numbers, all the composite numbers which are smaller than I into I, they must have been already marked prime. Okay. Um, for example, if we have 3, okay, we can directly start from 9, that is square of 3, because we know all the composite numbers which are smaller than 9, they must have been marked by some uh, other prime number. Okay, like we know 8 is also a composite, or 6 is 6 is a composite, and it's a multiple of 3 also, but we do not need to go over there again because 6 has been already marked as prime by already some other prime number. It has been marked as composite by some smaller prime number. So therefore, we start from I into I and we mark all of them as false. Okay. So the time complexity for this is O of n of log of n, and memory is O of n, okay, because we are creating a Boolean array of size n. Okay. Still about 20 people. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. Now this is the Python code for it. You see it's quite compact. This is always the benefit of using Python. Here I have done exactly the same thing. I created an, in Python we can multiply a list also. So if I create a list containing just one element, I multiply it by n plus 1. So it ultimately becomes a list of size n plus 1 and with the same content. Means at all the places we have n. And we start the loop from 2, we go all the way to n. We check if a number is prime. If it's prime, we iterate over all of its multiples. Here I have written 2 into I, though like it's more optimal to start from I into I, but I did it so that there is no rigid impression in your mind that you always have to start from I into I. Even if you start from 2 into I, it will work fine. In fact, for prime number, it's advisable to start from I into I, but in like sieve of those things is used for a lot of different kinds of problems also. And there you actually want each number to be visited by all of its prime factors. So in that case, you would rather prefer to start from 2 into 1. For example, we have a problem where we want to find out the number of distinct prime divisors of it. So there it is, there you can't skip any multiple of a prime number. There you would like to go over each multiple of it. Okay. So therefore, like here I have written as 2 into I, but whenever it's all only about knowing whether a number is prime or not, you're using sieve of those things for that purpose, then you can start from I into I. Of course, this we studied about sieve of Eratosthenes, but it has got its own drawbacks. The biggest drawback is that we actually need to allocate space, a lot of space for it. Like if we have numbers which can be as big as 10 to the power 18, then sieve of Eratosthenes can't be used because we can't allocate that much of space. And further, the time complexity and log of n, which actually looks quite good for smaller ends, that is also not impressive enough. Okay, for bigger numbers like 10 power 18. So we have some other methods also, and we are going to look at this prime Fermat primality test. Okay, and remember, Fermat primality test is not a deterministic test. Means if there is some number which passes this test, there is no guarantee that it is a prime. But yeah, if there is a number which fails this test, then we can say for sure that it is not prime. Okay. Um, the main idea is to use the concept of Fermat primality theorem, which states that a is to the power p minus 1 modulo p is equal to 1, where a and b are co-prime. Okay. Now, this always holds true when p is prime, and there are very rare composite numbers which, if you place at p, will satisfy this equation. Okay. So what we can do is, let's say we have a number n. What I can do is I can pick 7 different a's which are co-prime to it, and I can check if this condition holds true or not. Even if for one a we find that this condition doesn't hold true, we can say for sure that the number that we have is not a prime number because it's not following the Fermat primality theorem, Fermat's little theorem. But we can't be even if it satisfies for 100 of a's, 200 of a's, we still can't be be 100% sure that it's a prime number. Okay, you can be 100% sure only if you have checked it for all the co-prime a, all the numbers, all the a's which are co-prime to p, which is definitely not feasible. Okay, so the main idea is to do it with as many different a's as is possible. Like that depends upon like how much of like how fast you want your algorithm. Generally, it is advisable to check it for like 50 to 100 different a's. Okay, if it holds true, if this condition holds true for 50 to 100 different a's, then there is always a very high probability that the number that you took is a prime number. Okay, so like I hope this part is clear. Okay, how do we implement that? So we have A, and we want to pick up an A which is actually co-prime to P. So we are going to pick it from 2 to the power 2 to P minus 2. Okay, we can pick any number in that particular range, and we check, okay, if this condition holds true or not. Okay, if and any position we see that this condition doesn't hold true, then we terminate and we say that it's not a prime. And if it holds true for all the A's that we picked up, then it means that there is a very high probability that it's a prime number. And here we have a pseudocode explaining the same thing. Okay, you can easily write it in Python also. In Python, whenever you have to generate a random number in range I to n minus 1, you call the function rand int 1 comma n minus 1. Okay, you can check about these details. Okay. So you see what we are doing is we repetitively pick up some random number in the range. And why are we picking that number in this range? Because we further need to ensure that x is co-prime to n. Okay, that is the basic condition for Fermat-Little theorem, that a should be co-prime to p. So that's why we are picking that number from in this particular region. And if in any for any particular x you say that this condition doesn't hold true, we say that it's a composite, and otherwise we say that it's probably prime. Okay, there is a very high probability that it's prime. There are some other primality tests also, like there is this AKS primality test. There are many other primality tests also, which are like far beyond the scope of this, workshop. And generally, those primality tests are like quite fast for very big numbers, like numbers having thousands of digits, millions of digits. But if you apply those algorithms on smaller numbers, they are not that impressive. So you do not need to know about that. Okay, and there are like many deterministic algorithm also. Like AKS primality test is a deterministic primality testing algorithm. Now we come on Euler-Toshen function. So what is Euler-Toshen function? So we say that phi of n, like it is denoted by phi. This Euler-Toshen function is generally denoted by phi. We say phi of n is basically the number of integers from 1 to n which are co-prime to n. Okay. For example, phi of 10 is 4. Why? Because 1, 3, 7, 9. These are the four integers that lie in the range of 1 to 10, which are co-prime to 10. Okay. So phi of 10 is equal to 4. So often we need to find out the value of Euler-Toshen function for any general number. So for that we have some these cases or some special cases which will be used to find out the value of Euler-Toshen function for any general number. Like if you have phi of p where p is a prime number, then it's always equal to p minus 1. Why is it so? Because you pick up any number smaller than p, it's always co-prime to p. Okay, like if you have 5, all the numbers from 1 to 4, they are co-prime to it. Okay, therefore phi of p is always equal to p minus 1. Okay, so then we have this thing as phi of p raised to the power k. Like p is a prime number, and we say that phi of p raised to the power k is equal to p raised to the power k minus p raised to the power k minus 1. So let's see why is it so. Like we want to calculate, okay, the value of Euler-Toshen function for p raised to the power k. So firstly, we will calculate all the numbers in the range of 1 to p raised to the power k, which are actually not co-prime to p raised to the power k. And what are those numbers? They are just the multiples of p. So p, 2p, 3p, 4p, 5p, and you can go on to p raised to the power k. All these numbers are like not co-prime to p raised to the power k. Okay. And how many these numbers do we have? We have p raised to the power k minus 1 numbers. So therefore, if you ask what is the value of Euler-Toshen function for p raised to the power k, it is equal to p raised to the power k minus p raised to the power k minus 1. Okay. So and then the second thing is probably the most important thing, which is phi of a into b. It's always equal to phi of a into phi of b. But remember that a and b are co-prime over here. Okay. And this is a very important condition, and because of this condition, we say that Euler-Toshen function is a multiplicative function. Okay, so now using these three basic these three properties, we can calculate the Euler-Toshen function value for any general number. Let's say we have a number n, which is expressed as p1 raised to the power a1 into p2 raised to the power a2. 2. Okay. What we can simply do is, as all these co-prime to each other, I can write down them as the product of Euler-Toshen function of individual numbers. Okay. And then I calculate them using the second property that we just studied. Okay. And finally, it reduces to this equation, that is n into p1 minus 1 upon p1 into p2 minus 1 upon p2, like this. So if you want to find out the value of Euler-Toshen function for any number, what you simply have to do is you have to find out all the different prime numbers that divide it, okay? And then you have to use this particular formula. Okay, so for that, you need to know how to try and factorize a number. What is Euler's theorem? So Euler's theorem is a generalized form of Fermat's-Little theorem, or we can say that Fermat's-Little theorem is a special case of Euler's theorem. Okay, so there it's like, for Euler's theorem, we have a raised to the power phi of n is congruent to 1 mod n. Okay, where a and n are relatively prime. And why do we say that Fermat's-Little theorem is a special case of Euler's theorem? Because if at the place of n you put any prime number p, then we know that phi of p is equal to p minus 1. So it reduces to Fermat's-Little theorem. Okay. So this is like the straightforward definition of Euler's theorem. Okay. Now we have bitwise operator. So we, like in the Python part, you guys like studied about it, but let's repeat it once again. So what is bitwise AND operator? So it takes two operands and performs AND over every bit of two numbers. Okay. Like if we ask, if you want to know the value of 5 bitwise and 6, what we do is we express 5 in like bit binary form and 6 also in binary form, and then we take the AND of corresponding bits, like 0 and 0 is 0, or 1 and 1 is 1, 0 and 1 is 0, and 1 and 0 is 0. So 0, 1, 1, which is 4. And similarly, you can calculate the value of bitwise AND of 11 and 13 also. Now we have a bitwise OR operator. This basically takes the performs the bitwise OR over every bit of two numbers. Like we have 5 and 6. So 5 or 6 is equal to 0101 or 0110. So you see, you will get 7, if you implement that. Then we have bitwise XOR operator. So it performs the XOR operation, and we know what is XOR operation. 0 XOR 0 is 0, 1 XOR 1 is 0, 1 XOR 0 is 1, and 0 XOR 1 is 1. So using the truth table of bitwise XOR, you can calculate the value of bitwise XOR for any two numbers. Like 5 bitwise XOR 6 is equal to equals to 3, okay, and 11 XOR bitwise XOR 13 is equal to 6. Now what is bitwise left shift operator? What we do is whenever we have, like, say 1 and we want to shift it towards left by 2, what actually happens is two zeros will be appended in the end. Okay, like we had 0, 1 and two zeros, they will be appended into 1. Now if you say what is its decimal value, so it's equal to 4. Or if you have 2, you shift it by 3, your three zeros will be appended in the end and you will get 16. Okay? And all the attentive people might have already realized that if we shift a number by k bits, it's equivalent to multiplying it by 2 raised to the power k. So several times, rather than writing multiplied by 2 power k, you can simply say left shifted to left shifted by k. Okay? Like we say 2 into 2 power 3 is equal to 16, or 1 into 2 power 2 is equal to 4. Now we have bitwise right shift operator. So it drops off the least significant k bits. Okay, like if we have one right shift one, so you have 0, 1, and we will drop this last bit. Okay, so it becomes 0. Or if you have 11 right shift 2, what we do is we drop these last two ones. Okay, and you get 2 here. So, similarly, you can see that bitwise the right shift in a way is division by 2 raised to the power k. Okay. Like 1 divided by 2 power 1 is 0, and 11 divided by 2 power 2 is 2. Okay. Now, what is bitwise not operator? So, bitwise not operator takes the it takes an operand and it inverts each bit of this operand. Like if you have 4, then it's going to invert the 0 to 1, this 1 to 0, and these zeros will be inverted to 1. So you get 11. But remember that in reality, if if you do this thing in a Python console or in C++, you won't get this result. In fact, you will get -5. And why is it so? It's because internally the numbers are represented in the form of like one's complement or two's complement. I don't remember what we call it. So therefore, if you actually invert each bit, you will get a negative number. Okay. Whereas you can do one thing. You go in C. You actually can do this in C++. You can declare a variable as unsigned integer, and then you can try to perform the bitwise not operator. There you will get some positive value. Definitely not 11, something very big, because we know that there are a lot of leading zeros also, which will get converted into 1 after we take the bitwise not operator. Okay. Now, this is two very useful techniques. Okay. So several times what happens that we have a number and we want to find out the kth bit of that number. Means we want to find out whether the kth bit of that number is 1 or not. So how do we do that? Okay. So there's a thing which we will be seeing over here. Okay. Let's say we have a number 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. Okay, this it actually has a lot of bits and it's represented. Let's don't keep so many. Okay, and I want to find its kth bit. Okay, let's say k is equal to 3. Okay, by k equal to 3, I'm referring to this particular position. I want to know whether we have a 1 over here or we have a 0 over here. So what we do is we actually declare another number another variable, and we store one left shift 3 to it. Okay. So how will it look like? Like how will this number actually look? If you write it in binary form, it will be somewhat like this. Okay. You have three trailing zeros, and all the other numbers are also zeros, and you have a one only at this position. Now, if you take the bitwise AND of these two numbers, at all the locations other than k, you are definitely going to get a zero, because in the second operand you have already a zero. So it doesn't matter whether in the first number you have a one at that particular location or a zero, you will always get zero at those places. But what do we get at kth bit? It depends upon the bit value for the first number. Okay, whether this is one or it's zero. Okay, here it is one. So if you calculate the bitwise AND, you will get this. Okay, whereas if it would have been zero, you would have got 000. Okay, so basically the idea is we will take that number, we will perform its bitwise AND with one left shift k. We will obtain the result. We will see that if the result is non-zero, it means that at kth bit we had a one. We have the kth bit was set, or means the kth bit was one. And if it is a zero, then it means that the kth bit was zero. So this is exactly what I have written here. Like we find the value of expression n and one left shift k, and we check if it's zero or not. If it is zero, then it means that bk is zero, else it is one. The second thing is inverting the kth bit. Okay, so it's like several times what we have to do is we have been given a number and we want to invert a particular bit. Okay, like let's assume that this is the very number nk is equal to 3. That means I want to invert this number. By inverting, I mean to say that all the other bit values should remain unchanged. I just want to invert this particular value. So how do we do that? Okay, so for doing this, we again are going to declare a variable, um, and we are going to store one left shift k, and we are going to take its XOR. Okay, we are going to take its XOR with the original number. Okay, so why does it work? Let's see. Okay. We have zero at all the other locations. This is one left shift 3. Okay. Now, there is a very simple property, that is you take XOR of uh, uh, B XOR, this is not exponent, this is XOR. It's always equal to B. Okay, so if you take the XOR of any number with 0, you will get that number, that original number itself. Whereas if you take the XOR of any number with 1, with this B is actually bit, it's not a normal number, it's a bit, it represents bit, either 0 bit or 1 bit. Then it is B complement, means if you have 1, then you get a 0, and if you have a 0, you will get a 1. So therefore, what will happen, that all the other bit positions, they will remain unchanged, because at those particular bit locations, we have got a 0 in the second operand. So therefore, they will be 0 only. Whereas this, whether it will be 1 or 0, it depends upon the bit value that we have in the first number. If it is a 0, it gets inverted and it will become 0. It will become 1. And if it is originally 1, it will become 0 because of this property. Okay, that is B XOR 1 is always equal to B complement. So, so this is what. Okay, so this was all what we had to cover for number theory. So okay, there are 13 people. Okay, so that's all what I wanted to cover in number theory. Okay, for this particular workshop. I think if we can stop now.
किसी को कोई